Chapter 1. The Lantern Glows. The highway stretched across the Nebraska plains like a scar, cracked and faded, flanked by cornfields that swayed under a sky streaked with orange and purple. Maggie Voss gripped the steering wheel of her rusted pickup, her knuckles pale against the worn leather. At 38, she carried grief in the lines of her sharp face. Her dark hair hung in a messy bun, and her eyes, shadowed from too many sleepless nights, flicked to a photo taped to the dashboard. Her younger brother, Daniel, grinned back at her, mid-20s, in a faded baseball cap, a frozen moment of a life she'd lost. "Almost there, Danny," she murmured, her voice barely rising above the static crackling from the radio. A country song flickered in and out, its melody warped by the dying signal. Her phone's GPS blinked out, the screen going dark, no matter how she tapped it against the dash. Ahead, a weathered sign emerged from the haze. "Welcome to Marrowfield. Pop. 312. The paint was peeling, the numbers half erased, as if the town itself was slipping away. Maggie slowed the truck, tires crunching over gravel, and rolled into Marrowfield's skeletal husk. Boarded up storefronts stared blankly, their windows clouded with dust and grime. A grain silo leaned against the horizon, rusted and weary, while a lone stoplight blinked yellow in a pointless rhythm. A handful of locals lingered on sagging porches, gaunt figures with hollow cheeks and weathered skin, their eyes tracking her truck with a quiet, predatory weight. The air carried a faint tang of earth and something sour, like rot seeping up from the soil. She parked beside a crumbling gas station and stepped out, stretching her stiff legs. Her camera bag slumped on the passenger seat, stuffed with lenses, notebooks, and cords, tools of a photojournalist chasing stories on the edge of oblivion. Before she could catch her breath, a voice cut through the stillness, sharp and gravelly. "You the photographer, lady?" Ruth Tanner stood across the street, 50-ish and wiry, her flannel shirt faded and her jeans patched at the knees. A bone-handled knife hung sheathed at her hip, its handle yellowed and smooth. Her gray eyes pinned Maggie with a cold, appraising stare, like she was livestock being sized up for slaughter. "Yeah, Maggie Voss," she replied, meeting that gaze with a steadiness she had to force. Her hands tightened on her bag's strap, grounding her. Ruth nodded, a curt jerk of her head. "Got the trailer ready. Ain't much, but it's got a roof. Follow me." She turned without waiting, boots kicking up dust down a dirt path that snaked toward the town's edge. Maggie followed, the weight of those porch-bound stairs prickling the back of her neck, like unseen fingers brushing her skin. The trailer squatted on cinder blocks at the rim of a vast cornfield, a rusted single-wide dwarfed by towering stalks that rustled softly in the gathering dusk. The air here was heavier, thick with the scent of damp soil and that sour undertone she couldn't place. Ruth unlocked the door with a key that screeched in the lock, revealing a dim interior, peeling wallpaper stained yellow with age, a sagging couch patched with duct tape, a kitchenette where a single bulb flickered like a dying star. "Power's spotty, water's cold," Ruth said, her voice flat as the plains stretching beyond. "Don't wander the fields at night. Coyotes." "Coyotes, got it," Maggie said, managing a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. She shifted her weight, testing the waters. "Heard there's something about a bone lantern, part of the harvest stories I'm here for." Ruth's face tightened, a shadow crossing her eyes like a cloud blotting the moon. "Just tales," she said, her tone clipped and final. "Nothing worth a camera. Settle in. I'll see you tomorrow." She turned and left, her silhouette fading into the twilight, leaving Maggie alone with the creak of the trailer's frame and the corn's ceaseless whisper, a sound that felt alive, like it was breathing. Maggie dropped her bag on the couch and unpacked her camera, checking the lens with practiced hands. She flipped open her notebook, scribbled notes on Morrowfield's harvest rites, rumors of a bone lantern said to guide lost souls, and a chilling thread of missing persons reports stretching back decades. Exhaustion tugged at her bones, a dull ache that had settled in since Daniel's death, but the silence felt wrong, too thick, too heavy for a place so wide open. A moth battered the bulb overhead, its wings throwing jittery shadows across the walls, amplifying the unease curling in her gut. Then it started, a faint tapping, soft and irregular, like fingernails brushing metal. Maggie froze, head tilting. "Mice," she muttered to herself, trying to shake the chill creeping up her spine. She grabbed a flashlight from her bag and stepped to the window. Peering out, the cornfield stretched into blackness, the stalks swaying despite the still air. And then she saw it, a flicker of light, pale and unnatural, weaving through the corn. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat trapped in glass, drawing closer for a moment before retreating into the dark. "What the hell?" she breathed, snatching her camera. She zoomed in, but the light blurred through the lens, slippery as a ghost. The tapping grew louder, tap, 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 now rapping against the window pane, sharp and insistent. She spun, flashlight beam slicing the room. Nothing, just the empty trailer, the moth still dancing its frantic dance, the shadows twitching like they had a pulse. Heart thudding, she stepped outside, boots crunching gravel. The air was frigid now, her breath clouding in front of her. She aimed the flashlight into the cornfield, its beam swallowed by the stalks. The light was gone, but the tapping echoed faintly, circling her like a predator's footsteps. "Hello," she called, her voice thin, swallowed by the night. "Anyone there?" Silence answered, then a low rustle, sharp, deliberate, from the corn. She swung the beam, catching a glimpse of something pale darting between the stalks, too quick to name. Her pulse hammered in her throat. She backed toward the trailer, the tapping rising to a staccato beat. Tap, 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 against the walls, the door, the windows, a rhythm that felt alive, hunting. She slammed the door behind her, locking it with trembling hands, and leaned against it, breath ragged. The flashlight shook in her grip as she peered through the window again. The cornfield stood still, the light gone. The tapping stopped, abrupt as a held breath. She sank onto the couch, clutching her camera like a lifeline. Daniel's photo stared back from the table, his grin a silent anchor in the dimness. "What did I get myself into, Danny?" she murmured, her voice barely a thread, frayed with exhaustion and a creeping dread she couldn't name. A final tap, sharp, deliberate, rang from the ceiling above her. Maggie's head snapped up, eyes wide, searching the shadows that seemed to thicken around her. Outside, deep within the corn, the pale light flickered again, closer now, its glow casting long, twisted shadows that stretched toward the trailer like skeletal fingers reaching for her soul. Chapter 2. The Old Ways. Maggie woke to a gray dawn seeping through the trailer's cracked blinds, the air heavy with damp darkness and the faint musk of corn. Her neck ached from the lumpy couch, and her dreams had been jacked. Daniel's voice calling from somewhere dark, drowned by rustling stalks. She rubbed her eyes, the tapping from last night echoing in her mind like a half-remembered threat. The camera sat on the table, Daniel's photo beside it, his grin a quiet rebuke to the unease curling in her chest. She brewed weak coffee in the trailer's stuttering pot, the bulb flickering overhead as she flipped through her notebook. Marrowfield's harvest rites gnawed at her, whispers of a bone lantern, tied to old rituals no one spoke of openly. She needed answers. Grabbing her camera and a jacket, she stepped outside. The cornfield loomed, its stalks still under a sky thick with clouds, the pale light from last night nowhere in sight. The town felt smaller in daylight, its edges sharper. Maggie headed for the bar, a squat, weathered building with a neon sign buzzing faintly, Cal's Place. Inside, the air was stale, thick with cigarette smoke and the tang of spilled beer. A handful of locals hunched over tables, their eyes sliding toward her as she entered. She approached the bar, where an old man polished a glass with a rag. Cal, she guessed, 70 at least, his face creased like dry earth, his hands trembling slightly. "You Cal?" she asked, setting her camera on the counter. He nodded, barely looking up. "Maggie Voss. I'm here about the harvest stories, the bone lantern." His hand stilled, the rag dropping. "Ain't much to tell," he muttered, voice rough as gravel. "Old folks made up tales to scare kids. That's all. Doesn't sound like nothing," she pressed, leaning in. "People don't clam up over fairy tales." Cal's eyes flicked to hers, sharp and wary. "Leave before the harvest moon," he said low. "That lantern, it sees you back. Don't go looking for it." He turned away, ending the talk, but his words stuck like burrs. Back at the trailer, Maggie sorted her gear, unease gnawing deeper. She found an old photo tucked in a drawer, a faded sepia print of farmers in stiff collars, holding a grotesque lantern, bone and sinew twisted into a cage, its light casting shadows that stretched too long, too wrong. Her breath caught. This was no story. That night the tapping returned, sharper, insistent, tap, tap, tap against the trailer's walls. She grabbed her flashlight, heart thudding, and peered out. The cornfield was dark, but a shadow shifted, tall, thin, gone when she blinked. She checked the locks, the photo trembling in her hand. Cal's warning rang louder now. Sleep wouldn't come. She sat up, camera ready, listening as the tapping circled, a rhythm that felt alive. Waiting. Chapter 3. The Corn Whispers. Morning broke over Marrowfield with a thin, cold light, the sky a slab of gray pressing down on the cornfields. Maggie hadn't slept. Her eyes burned, her nerves raw from the night's tapping, a sound that lingered like a pulse in the trailer's walls. She clutched her coffee mug, the bitter dregs doing little to shake the fog in her head. Daniel's photo watched her from the table, his grin a silent tether to a world that felt farther away each hour she spent here. The sepia image of the bone lantern haunted her thoughts, those farmers' stiff faces, the twisted relic glowing in their hands. She needed to see the fields for herself. She slung her camera over her shoulder, pulled on her jacket, and stepped outside. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of soil and rotting husks. The cornfield stretched before her, its stalks towering and dense, swaying faintly despite the stillness. She hesitated, Ruth's warning about coyotes echoing, but Cal's words, "It sees you back," pulled harder. She plunged in, the stalks brushing her arms, their dry rustle a chorus that swallowed her footsteps. The deeper she went, the tighter the field closed around her. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy, casting slivers of shadow that flickered like eyes. She snapped photos, stalks, dirt, the endless maze, her breath quickening as the rustling grew louder, sharper. Then she heard it, a whisper, low and guttural, threading through the corn. "Maggie," it hissed, her name stretched into something feral. She froze, camera trembling in her hands. "Who's there?" she called, voice cracking. The whisper came again. "Maggie." From behind, then beside her, a circle of sound she couldn't pin down. She pushed forward, heart hammering, until the stalks parted. There, staked in the earth, stood a scarecrow, ragged burlap draped over a crooked frame, its head a human skull, yellowed and cracked, its jaw wired shut with rusted coils. Maggie stumbled back, breath catching. The eye socket stared, empty yet alive, and the whispers swelled. "Maggie, Maggie," a chorus of voices, raw and hungry. She raised her camera, hands shaking, and snapped a shot. The flash flared, and the whisper stopped, abrupt as a snapped thread. Footsteps crunched behind her. She spun, flashlight up, and Ruth emerged from the corn, her face tight with fury. "Told you not to come here," she snapped, her bone-handled knife glinting in her grip. "This ain't your place." "What the hell is that?" Maggie demanded, pointing at the scarecrow. Ruth's eyes flicked to it, then away, her jaw clenching. "Keeps the field safe," she muttered. "Go back, now." Maggie didn't argue. She retraced her steps, Ruth's presence a cold weight at her back. At the trailer, Ruth lingered, staring into the corn. "Stay out," she said, softer, almost pleading, before turning away. Maggie locked the door, pulse still racing, and checked her camera. The scarecrow photo was blurry, but something else showed. A tall, thin figure in the background, holding a glowing shape. Her stomach dropped. That night, the tapping returned. Tap, 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 louder, circling the trailer. She grabbed her flashlight, peering out. The cornfield was dark, but the whisper started again. "Maggie," faint, insistent, seeping through the walls. She clutched Daniel's photo, her breath shallow, knowing she'd crossed a line she couldn't unstep. Chapter 4. The marked Maggie woke to a dull, persistent ache in her arms, the trailer's air thick with a damp staleness that coated her throat. Sleep had been a fleeting ghost, chased off by the cornfield's whispers. Maggie, Maggie, that wove through her dreams with the scarecrow's skull, its wired jaw gaping in mute agony. She'd collapsed on the sagging couch, flashlight still gripped tight, her neck now a knot of stiffness. She rubbed her eyes, gritty with exhaustion, and glanced at Daniel's photo on the table. His grin felt like a distant memory, a lifeline fraying in this decaying place. She stumbled to the sink, craving water to clear the fog, but froze mid-step. Her sleeves had ridden up, revealing jagged scratches, red, claw-like, snaking across her forearms from wrist to elbow, angry and fresh. Her breath caught, a cold panic spiking in her chest. They hadn't been there when she'd fallen asleep, clutching the flashlight against the night's unease. She touched one, wincing at the sting, then yanked her sleeves down, hiding the marks from the gray light seeping through the cracked blinds. The coffee pot sputtered as she brewed a cup, its weak steam barely steadying her trembling hands. She sat, staring at Daniel's photo, then pulled her camera closer. The scarecrow photo stared back, that blurry figure in the background, holding a glowing shape too sharp to dismiss. Cal's warning echoed in her skull. It sees you back, and the sepia image of the bone lantern burned in her mind. She needed answers, not shadows. She grabbed her jacket, slung the camera over her shoulder, and stepped outside. The cornfield loomed under a sky heavy with clouds, its rustle a low, restless growl at her back. Marrowfield felt colder today, its streets emptier, the silence pressing in like a held breath. A stray dog nosed through trash near the gas station, its ribs stark against matted fur. Maggie headed for Cal's place, the bar's neon sign buzzing faintly, a sickly glow in the daylight. Inside, the air was a stale haze, cigarette smoke curling around the tang of old beer and sweat. A few locals hunched over tables, their gaunt faces turning, eyes tracking her with a weight that prickled her skin. Cal stood behind the bar, 70 at least, his hands trembling as he polished a glass with a rag older than the wood beneath it. "You're back," he grunted, voice rough as gravel, not meeting her gaze. She slapped the scarecrow photo on the counter, the sound sharp in the quiet. "Explain this." Cal's hand stilled, the glass slipping to clatter in the sink. He leaned closer, squinting at the blurry figure, the glowing shape in its grasp. His face drained of color, creases deepening. "You went in the fields," he said, low and accusing. "Told you to leave." "What is it, Cal?" Maggie pressed, leaning in, her voice tight with desperation. "The lantern, the scarecrow. What's this town hiding?" Her scratched arms itched under her sleeves, a slow burn spreading. He glanced at the other patrons, silent, staring, their eyes like dark pits, then leaned closer, his breath sour and hot. Settlers made a pact long ago. Winter was killing them, crops dead, kids starving. They gave blood to the land, their own kin, to make it grow again. That lantern's their debt, bone and soul, forged from what they buried. It chooses a keeper each harvest, someone marked by loss, grief, sees you back if you don't pay. His gaze dropped to her arms, narrowing. "You're marked now, ain't you?" Her stomach twisted. She pulled up a sleeve, revealing the scratches. Darker now, red fading to bruised purple, weeping a thin trickle of black sap that smelled faintly of rot. Cal recoiled, the rag falling. "Get out," he hissed, voice cracking. "Before the harvest moon. Go." She stumbled out, his words a weight sinking into her chest. The streets blurred as she hurried back to the trailer, the cornfield's rustle rising like a tide. Inside, she scrubbed the scratches with a rag, but the black ooze clung, sticky and cold, seeping deeper. The tapping started. Tap, 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 louder, relentless, circling the walls. She grabbed her flashlight, heart hammering, and peered out. Shadows shifted in the corn, tall and thin. Then hands, skeletal, clawing at the windows, their bones glowing faintly through tattered flesh, black sap dripping from jagged nails. She stumbled back, a scream catching in her throat. The door rattled, a violent shudder. She braced it with her shoulder, pulse racing as the tapping swelled. Tap, 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 a drumbeat in her skull. The hands pressed harder, smearing black streaks across the glass. Then silence, abrupt and suffocating. She sank to the floor, clutching her arms, the scratches pulsing warm and alive. Outside, the corn whispered, "Maggie." Soft, a hungry promise threading through the dark. Chapter 5. The harvest moon rises. Maggie barely stirred as dawn crept into the trailer, a pale sliver through the blinds that did nothing to warm the chill in her bones. She'd spent the night curled against the door, the skeletal hands tapping, tap, 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 echoing in her skull even after they had vanished. Sleep had come in fits, broken by the cornfield's whispers. Maggie, and the throb of her scratched arms, now a constant ache. She dragged herself up, joints creaking, and caught her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her face was gaunt, eyes sunken, the scratches darker, purple-black, oozing sap that stained her sleeves. She pressed a rag to them, wincing as the ooze clung, cold and slick, like it was alive. Daniel's photo stared from the table, his grin a cruel reminder of why she'd come, to chase stories, to outrun grief. Now it felt like a trap. She brewed coffee, the pot's hiss a faint comfort, and flipped through her notebook. Cal's packed, the lanterns dead, the keeper marked by loss. Her arms pulsed in time with her heartbeat, a rhythm she couldn't shake. Outside, the cornfield stood silent, but the sky hung low, heavy with the promise of the harvest moon Cal had warned her about. She grabbed her camera and stepped out, needing to see the town, to understand. Merrowfield buzzed with a strange energy. Locals moved through the streets, their faces tight, eyes averted. Children sat on porches, carving bones into tiny lanterns with dull knives, their hands steady, their gazes vacant. Maggie snapped photos, her lens catching the eerie stillness in their expressions. A woman in a faded dress glanced at her, then away, muttering something Maggie couldn't catch. The air smelled of smoke and earth, a tension building she could taste. At the field's edge, she found Ruth overseeing a group, men and women piling corn husks into a bonfire pit, their movements mechanical. Ruth spotted her gray eyes narrowing. "Thought you'd be gone by now," she said, voice low, her bone-handled knife gleaming at her hip. "What's happening?" Maggie asked, camera trembling in her grip. "The moon, the lanterns, what's it all for?" Ruth's jaw tightened. "Keeps the fields fed," she said, cryptic and cold. "Lantern's light grows when it finds a keeper, someone marked." Her gaze flicked to Maggie's arms, a flicker of something, fear, maybe pity, crossing her face. "You shouldn't be here." Maggie pulled her sleeve up, the scratches stark against her pale skin, the black sap thicker now, dripping to the ground. "This what you mean?" she snapped. Ruth stepped back, hand twitching toward her knife. "Go," she said, softer, "while you can." Maggie turned away, heart pounding, but the town wouldn't let her go that easily. She tried her truck, tires slashed, bone shards embedded deep. She cursed, kicking the gravel, then froze. The tapping returned, tap, 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 faint at first, circling the trailer as dusk fell. She rushed inside, locking the door, but it grew louder, sharper, a chorus against the walls. The harvest moon rose, bloated and red, casting a sickly glow through the windows. She peered out. Figures stood in the corn, robed in burlap, their faces hidden, holding tiny bone lanterns that pulsed like heartbeats. The tapping swelled, tap, 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 and the scratches flared, burning hot. She clutched her arms, sap pooling in her palms, as the door shuddered. Skeletal hands pressed the glass again, glowing brighter, their nails scraping trails of black. She braced the door, breath ragged, flashlight trembling. The whispers joined in. "Maggie," a chant now, weaving with the tapping. The figures outside swayed, their lanterns flaring in sync with her pulse. She slid to the floor, Daniel's photo tumbling from the table, his face lost in the shadows. The moon's light bled through the cracks and she knew whatever the lantern wanted, it was coming for her tonight. Chapter 6. The Keeper's Call. Maggie jolted awake, heart slamming against her ribs, the trailer's walls still ringing with the echo of last night's tapping. Tap, 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 tap. She'd fallen asleep, slumped against the door, the harvest moon's red glow fading into a bleak dawn that seeped through the blinds. Her arms throbbed, the scratches now a deep, mottled purple, the black sap crusted along their edges, flaking onto the floor like ash. She wiped her hands on her jeans, but the ooze lingered, cold and tacky, a stain she couldn't scrub away. The air felt heavier, pressing down, thick with the cornfield's musk and a faint, sour rot. She stumbled to her feet, legs shaky, and glanced at Daniel's photo, face down on the floor, knocked over in her restless night. She picked it up, fingers trembling, his grin a fading lifeline. The dream clung to her, Daniel, his face hollowed out, eyes black pits, holding the bone lantern as he led her through the corn. "Come with me," he'd whispered, voice not his own, a guttural rasp that chilled her even now. She shook it off, but the scratches pulsed, syncing with her heartbeat, a rhythm she couldn't escape. The coffee pot hissed as she brewed a cup, its bitter steam a frail shield against the dread pooling in her gut. She checked her camera. The last photo showed the robed figures from the night before, their tiny lanterns glowing like embers, their faces lost in shadow. She needed to move, to fight this, but her truck was useless, tires shredded by bone shards. She stepped outside, the cornfield silent under a sky bruised with clouds, the moon's afterglow still haunting the horizon. The town was a ghost, streets empty, the bonfire pit smoldering with husks. She headed for Cal's bar, her only thread left. Inside, the air was stale, the bar deserted save for Cal, hunched over a bottle, his tremor worse. "You didn't leave," he croaked, voice raw, eyes bloodshot. "Couldn't," she said, slamming the camera down. "Tires slashed. Tell me how to stop it." He laughed, a dry, broken sound. "Ain't no stopping it. Lantern's got you, marked you." He pointed at her arms, sap glistening in the dim light. "Keeper's what it wants, someone to carry the light, feed the pact." "Then why me?" she snapped, voice cracking. "Grief," he said, quieter. "It smells it. Your brother." She flinched, and he nodded. "That's its hook." She turned to leave, but the tapping hit, tap, 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 sharp, inside the trailer now. She ran back, bursting through the door. The bone lantern sat on the table, grotesque, woven from bone and sinew, its glow pulsing like a living thing. She hadn't brought it in. Her breath seized as the scratches burned, sap dripping faster. Skeletal hands clawed up through the floorboards, glowing, grasping at her boots. She kicked free, stumbling back, the lantern's light flaring brighter. The whispers surged. "Maggie!" A chorus now, filling the room. She grabbed a chair, smashing it at the hands, wood splintering as they retreated. The lantern stayed, unyielding, its glow searing her eyes. She fled to Cal's again, pounding on the locked door. He opened it, pale and swaying. "Help me," she begged. He stared at her arms, then the cornfield. "Too late," he rasped, slamming the door. She turned. Figures stood at the field's edge, robed, lanterns pulsing. The tapping followed her, a heartbeat in the earth. Chapter 7. The Fields Bleed. Maggie stood rooted outside Cal's locked door, his final words, too late, a cold blade twisting in her gut. The tapping pulsed beneath her feet, a heartbeat thrumming through the earth, syncing with the ache in her scratched arms. across the street, its stalk swaying under a sky choked with gray clouds, the robed figure's lanterns flickering like dying stars in the gathering dusk. Her forearms burned, the scratches now a deep mottled black, oozing sap that dripped in thick sluggish drops, hitting the gravel with a soft, wet plink. She clutched her camera, its familiar weight a flimsy anchor against the dread clawing up her spine, and glanced back at the trailer. The bone lantern waited there. She could feel its pull, a cold, invisible thread tugging at her chest, her soul. She couldn't stay here, not another night. She bolted for her truck, ignoring the fire lancing up her arms with each step. The slashed tires stared back, bone shards glinting in the rubber like jagged teeth, a cruel mockery of a hope. She yanked the door open, fumbling with the keys, her breath hitching. Maybe it'd still roll, just far enough. The engine sputtered, coughed a plume of acrid exhaust, then died with a pitiful whine. She slammed the steering wheel, a raw curse tearing from her throat, then froze. The cornfield's rustle sharpened into a low, guttural growl, the stalks shifting as if alive. She stumbled out, boots crunching gravel, and ran for the highway, legs heavy, lungs burning, the town shrinking behind her. The road stretched ahead, a gray ribbon fading into haze. She pushed harder, the scratches pulsing, sap trailing in her wake, but the corn closed in, stalks bending inward, blocking her path like a living wall. She veered left, more corn, right, the same, towering and relentless. Her chest heaved as she spun, the road looping back impossibly, Marrowfield's crooked silhouette looming again. The tapping chased her, tap, 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 in the dirt, in her skull, a rhythm she couldn't outrun. She sank to her knees, sap staining the asphalt black, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face, the ooze cold against her skin. Back at the trailer, she locked herself in, panting, the lantern's glow pulsing on the table like a heartbeat. She grabbed a chair, smashing it down. Bone cracked, sinew tore, the light flickered, but it reformed, stitching itself whole, its glow flaring brighter, mocking her. The scratches throbbed, sap pooling in her palms, sticky and warm. She collapsed against a wall, staring out as night fell. The cornfield changed, stalks wilted overnight, husks weeping black liquid that puddled in the dirt, a stench of rot flooding the air, thick and choking. She gagged, pressing a sleeve to her mouth, and watched the ground tremble, a faint ripple snaking through the fields. Dawn broke, bleak and cold, and the town stirred with purpose. Maggie peered from the window. Locals gathered at the field's edge, robed in burlap, Ruth at the helm. She held her bone-handled knife, slashing her palm without flinching, blood dripping onto the soil as they chanted in a guttural, alien tongue. The black puddles quivered, soaking it up greedily, spreading like ink. Children joined, clutching tiny bone lanterns that glowed faintly, their faces blank, eyes hollow as they moved in unison. Maggie snapped photos, hands shaking, the lens catching Ruth's grim focus, the corn's decay, the eerie stillness of the kids' march. The tapping surged, tap, 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 tap louder, vibrating the trailer's walls, rattling the windows. She dropped the camera, clutching her arms as the scratches flared, a searing heat radiating through her. The glass cracked, skeletal hands clawing through, glowing brighter, their tattered flesh dripping black sap that streaked the panes. She screamed, shoving the couch against them, but they pushed back, nails scraping wood with a sound like tearing flesh. The The ground outside split, a jagged, shuddering tear, revealing a writhing mass of bones beneath, tangled and alive, pale tendrils reaching up through the black ooze, groping toward the surface. She fell back, breath hitching, Danielle's photo tumbling to the floor, his grin lost in the shadows. The chanting swelled, a tidal wave crashing over her, and the lantern's light pulsed in sync with the bones, with her scratches, with the town's ravenous hunger. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound burrowed deeper, and the fields bled for her, claiming her inch by inch. Chapter 8. The Pact Revealed. Maggie crouched in the trailer's dimness, the air thick with the stench of rot wafting from the bleeding fields outside. Her arms trembled, the scratches a searing black lattice, sap oozing in slow, glistening trails that pooled on the floorboards. The bone lantern sat on the table, its grotesque weave of sinew and bone glowing with a sickly pulse. A heartbeat she felt in her chest, her veins. The skeletal hands had retreated, their clawing silenced, but the cracked window bore their black streaks, a grim testament to their reach. She shoved the couch back, her breath shallow, Daniel's photo still face down where it had fallen. The chanting from the town lingered in her ears, a guttural hymn that burrowed into her skull, inescapable. She couldn't stay here, pinned like prey. The truck was dead, the road a trap, but the fields called, whispers weaving through the corn. Maggie, Maggie, soft and insistent. She grabbed her camera, its weight a frail tether to reason, and slipped out, the lantern's glow fading behind her. The cornfield stretched under a sky bruised with dusk, the stalks wilted and slick with black ooze, their husks drooping like weeping flesh. The ground squelched beneath her boots, each step sinking into the mire, the tapping, tap, 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 echoing faintly in the earth. She pushed deeper, driven by a reckless need to understand, to fight. The air grew colder, the rustling louder, until the stalks parted around a crumbling well, stone worn smooth, its mouth a dark gash in the field's heart. She knelt, flashlight beams slicing the shadows, revealing walls etched with frantic scratches, pleas for mercy, names carved in desperation. Her pulse quickened as she spotted a leather-bound fragment wedged in a crack. She pried it free, the pages brittle, ink faded but legible. It was a journal dated 1872, the scrawl of a settler named Amos Crane. The land starved us, it began. Winter took our children, our hope. We begged the earth, and it answered, blood for bounty. We gave our kin, carved their bones into the lantern to bind the pact. It feeds now, each harvest, a keeper to carry its light, or it takes us all. Maggie's hand shook, the words sinking in. The hunger wakes beneath, endless, and we are its keepers. She flipped the page, a sketch of the lantern, its glow spilling over a pile of bones, a shadowed figure looming above. Her scratches flared, sap dripping faster, staining the paper black. The ground trembled, a low rumble shaking the well. She stumbled back, the flashlight tumbling into the muck as the whispers surged. Maggie, a chorus now, rising from the depths. She turned to flee, but the corn tightened, stalks curling inward, trapping her in their maze. The tapping swelled, tap, 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 vibrating through her boots, her bones. She clawed at the stalks, but they held firm, slick and unyielding, forcing her back to the well. A shadow moved, Ruth, stepping from the corn, her face grim, knife in hand. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, voice low, her gray eyes hollow. It's too late now. What's down there? Maggie demanded, clutching the journal, her arms burning. What's the hunger? Ruth's gaze flicked to the well, then back. What we made, what we owe. The lantern chooses, and you're it. She raised her knife, but hesitated, a tremor in her grip. Run if you can. Won't change nothing. She turned away, vanishing into the stalks, leaving Maggie alone with the rumbling earth. The lantern appeared in her hands, sudden, heavy, its glow searing her palms. She hadn't carried it, hadn't touched it, but there it was, bone fusing to her skin, light pulsing brighter. She screamed, dropping it, but it stuck, sinew wrapping her fingers, sap mingling with her blood. The ground split wider, a jagged tear, and the bones beneath writhed, hundreds, tangled in a grotesque dance, reaching up with skeletal hands that glowed like the lantern's core. The whispers roared. Maggie, a demand, a claim. She fell to her knees, the lantern's weight dragging her down, her scratches pulsing in time with its light. The cornfield shuddered, black ooze flooding the well, and the bones stretched higher, clawing at the air inches from her face. She clutched the journal, its pages crumbling, and saw Daniel's face in her mind, not grinning, but hollow, calling her name. The pact was real, and she was its keeper now, bound to the hunger beneath the fields. Chapter 9. The hunger stirs. Maggie knelt by the well, the bone lantern fused to her hands, its glow searing her flesh as the ground beneath her shuddered with a low, guttural rumble. The journal's pages lay scattered in the black ooze, Amos Crane's words, blood for bounty, a keeper to carry its light, burning in her mind. Her scratched arms pulsed, the black sap mingling with her blood, dripping into the well's dark maw where the bones writhed, a tangled mass of skeletal fingers clawing upward. The cornfield tightened around her, stalks slick with rot, their whispers, Maggie, a deafening roar that drowned her ragged breaths. She tried to pry the lantern free, nails tearing at the sinew, but it held fast, bone melding to bone, a living shackle she couldn't break. Footsteps crunched behind her, sharp and deliberate. She spun, the lantern's light flaring, illuminating a circle of robed figures emerging from the corn, townsfolk, their faces gaunt and eyeless, hollow sockets staring blindly. Ruth stood at their front, her knife dripping red, her expression a mask of grim resolve. "Told you to run," she said, voice flat, but her hands trembled, betraying the weight of her words. The children flanked her, clutching their tiny bone lanterns, their blank gazes fixed on Maggie, mouths moving in unison with the chant, a guttural hymn that shook the air. "What are you doing?" Maggie rasped, staggering to her feet, the lantern dragging her arms down. "Let me go." Ruth shook her head, stepping closer. "Can't. You're the keeper now. The hunger's awake. It needs you." She gestured to the well, where the bones surged higher, cracking against the stone rim. "We feed it, or it takes us all." The townsfolk closed in, their robes rustling like dry husks, lanterns pulsing in sync with hers. Maggie swung the bone lantern, its glow slashing shadows across their eyeless faces, but they didn't flinch. Hands, flesh and bone, grabbed her, cold and unyielding, dragging her toward the well. She kicked, screamed, her boots slipping in the ooze, but the chant grew louder, a tidal wave crashing over her resolve. The lantern burned hotter, its light spilling into the well, and the ground split wider, a jagged fissure ripping through the field. A roar erupted, deep and primal, shaking the earth. Maggie froze as the hunger rose, a towering skeletal mass woven from corn husks and bone, its form shifting, unstable. Its maw was a vortex of gnashing teeth, splintered ribs curling like claws, black sap dripping from its hollow core. The townsfolk released her, falling to their knees, chanting faster, their lanterns flaring. Ruth raised her knife, slashing her other palm, blood spattering the ground. The hunger lunged, its maw engulfing her. Her body crumpled, ash scattering as the entity swallowed her whole. Maggie stumbled back, the lantern's light pulsing wildly, her scratches searing as if branded. The hunger turned, its eyeless gaze locking onto her hunger older than the land itself. She ran, crashing through the corn, stalks snapping under her weight, but the field twisted, forcing her back to the well. The townsfolk rose, eyeless faces tilting, their chant a single word, keep her, over and over, a command she couldn't escape. The lantern flared, its glow fusing deeper into her hands, bone cracking as it spread up her wrists. She fell, clutching it, and smashed it against the well's edge, once, twice, shards flying, sinew tearing. It shattered, light dimming, but the pieces writhed, reforming in her grasp, stronger, brighter. The hunger roared again, surging closer, its skeletal claws raking the air inches from her face. The ground buckled, black ooze flooding around her, and the bones beneath erupted, hundreds, grasping, pulling at her legs. She clawed free, sobbing, Daniel's face flashing in her mind. Not his grin, but the hollowed dream version, beckoning her to this. The townsfolk advanced, their eyeless sockets weeping black, lanterns pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The hunger loomed, its maw gaping, and she felt the lantern's light surge through her, a tether to its will. She was no longer just Maggie. She was its keeper, its voice, its prey, bound to the pact she'd never signed. Chapter 10. The Escape. Maggie staggered back from the well, the bone lantern's glow searing her hands as the hunger towered above, its skeletal mass of corn husks and bone quivering with ravenous intent. The townsfolk's eyeless faces chanted, "Keep her!" Their voices a relentless tide, their tiny lanterns pulsing in time with the one fused to her flesh. The ground churned, black ooze bubbling around her boots, skeletal hands grasping from below, their bony fingers brushing her ankles with a cold, insistent hunger. Her scratched arms burned, the black sap streaming down her wrists, mingling with the lantern's light, a tether she couldn't sever. The hunger's maw gaped, teeth gnashing, and she felt its pull, a void calling her name. Maggie, in a voice that wasn't Daniel's anymore, but something ancient, endless. She tore free, boots slipping in the muck, and ran. The cornfield lashed at her, stalks snapping like whips, their wilted husks dripping black as she crashed through. The lantern weighed her down, its bone tendrils tightening around her hands, but she pushed harder, lungs burning, the well's roar fading behind her. The townsfolk's chant grew distant, swallowed by the rustling corn, and the ground steadied beneath her feet. She burst from the field's edge, collapsing onto the gravel near her trailer, breath heaving, sap staining the dirt black beneath her. The trailer loomed, its door ajar, the lantern's twin glow dim within. She crawled inside, slamming it shut, locking it with trembling fingers. The bone lantern in her hands pulsed faintly, its light dimming but unyielding, fused to her skin like a parasite. She grabbed a knife from the kitchenette, sawing at the sinew. Her blood welled, mixing with the sap, but the bone held fast, reforming under her blade. She dropped it, sobbing, and sank to the floor. Daniel's photo staring from the table, his grin a silent accusation. Outside, the cornfield stood still, the black ooze pooling at its edges, the townsfolk gone, or so she thought. She peered through the cracked window. Merrowfield was silent. The robed figures vanished, their lanterns extinguished. The ground trembled once, then settled, the hunger retreating beneath the earth. She exhaled, a fragile hope flickering, and rummaged through the trailer. Her truck was dead, but a rusted pickup sat behind Cal's bar, keys glinting in the ignition when she'd last seen it. She grabbed her camera, notebook, and Daniel's photo, stuffing them into her bag, and slipped out, the lantern's weight dragging her steps. The town was a graveyard, empty streets, smoldering bonfire pits, the bar's neon sign dark. She crept to the pickup, breath held, and turned the key. It coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. She floored it, tires spitting gravel, Merrowfield shrinking in the rearview mirror. The highway stretched ahead, a gray lifeline, and she drove, the lantern's glow dimming in her lap, her scratches throbbing but quiet. Miles blurred, 5, 10, 20, until a gas station flickered into view, its lights a beacon in the night. She pulled in, hands shaking, and killed the engine, the silence deafening. The clerk, a wiry man with a patchy beard, eyed her as she stumbled in, sap-stained and wild-eyed. "You okay, lady?" he asked, voice wary. She nodded, muttering about a breakdown, and bought gasoline, her voice hoarse. Back at the truck, she doused the journal pages, almost cranes packed, and struck a match, watching them curl into ash, the words "blood for bounty" vanishing in flame. The lantern flickered, its glow waning, and she dared to hope it was over. She peeled off her jacket, the scratches crusting over, the sap drying to a dull sheen. She drove again, a cheap motel rising from the plains hours later. She checked in, the clerk barely glancing at her, and locked herself in a room, peeling wallpaper, a sagging bed, the hum of a flickering bulb. She set the lantern on the nightstand, its light faint, and collapsed, exhaustion pulling her under. Sleep came, dreamless at first, then fractured. Daniel's hollow face, the cornfield bleeding, the lantern's glow flaring in her hands. She woke to a faint tapping, tap, 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 soft circling the room. Her heart sank. The lantern pulsed brighter, sap trickling from her scratches anew. She grabbed her camera, flipping through the photos. Every frame from Merrowfield showed the lantern, even shots she hadn't taken, its glow bleeding into the edges. The TV flickered on, static crackling. Then a news report. Crops rotting across counties, missing persons rising. She muted it, hands trembling, and stared at the lantern. It hadn't let go. She'd carried it out, and now it followed, its hunger spreading. The tapping grew, tap, 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 tap at the window, skeletal shadows shifting outside. She clutched Daniel's photo, whispering his name, but the corn's whisper answered, Maggie, soft, eternal, a promise she couldn't outrun. Chapter 11. The light spreads. Maggie sat on the motel bed, the bone lantern's faint glow casting jittery shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Weeks had passed since she'd fled Merrowfield, the rusted pickup her lifeline, but the tapping, tap, 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 followed, a soft, relentless echo that haunted every stop. Her arms ached, the scratches scabbed over but pulsing beneath the surface, black sap seeping through the cracks when she least expected it. motel room, cheap, stale, with the flickering bulb and a mattress that sagged under her weight, was her latest refuge, a nowhere town miles from Nebraska's rotting fields. She ditched the truck days ago, trading it for cash at a junkyard, hoping distance would sever the lantern's grip. It hadn't. Daniel's photo sat propped on the nightstand, his grin a fading beacon in the dimness. She clutched it sometimes, whispering his name like a prayer, but the corn's whisper, Maggie, answered instead, threading through the walls, the air, her dreams. The lantern rested beside the photo, its bone and sinew frame dim but alive, pulsing faintly in time with her heartbeat. She'd tried to ditch it, buried it in a ditch, tossed it in a river, but it always reappeared, heavy in her hands, its glow a quiet taunt. Her scratches flared when she fought it, sap dripping, a reminder of the pact she'd never signed. She flipped through her camera, the photos a nightmare gallery. Every shot from Marrowfield showed the lantern, its light bleeding into frames she hadn't taken, shadowy figures lurking in the corners. The TV hummed, static crackling before a news report cut through. Unexplained crop failures spread across the Midwest, missing persons cases rising. She muted it, hands trembling, the words too close to the rot she had left behind. The clerk downstairs had complained last night. Faint singing, he'd said, drifting from her room. She hadn't sung, hadn't spoken, but the whispers followed her, and now they spread. The tapping started again. Tap, 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 soft at first, circling the room, tapping at the windows, the door, the ceiling. She grabbed her flashlight, its beam shaky, and peered outside. The parking lot stretched empty under a moonless sky, but skeletal shadows shifted. Tall, thin, their bones glowing faintly through tattered flesh, hands pressed to the glass of nearby cars. She stumbled back, breath hitching, as the tapping grew. Tap, 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 tap. A rhythm that synced with the lantern's pulse, with her scratches throb. The shadows didn't enter, just watched. They were hollow presence, a promise of what waited. She sank onto the bed, clutching her arms, the sap staining her sleeves anew. The motel's walls creaked, a low groan she hadn't noticed before, and the bulb flickered faster, casting the room in strobing light. She grabbed her notebook, scribbled notes from Marrowfield, Amos Crane's journal fragments, and traced the words. A keeper to carry its light, or it takes us all. The lantern flared, its glow spilling across the page, and she felt it, warmth spreading up her wrists, bone tendrils creeping beneath her skin, fusing deeper. She clawed at it, nails bloody, but it held, unyielding, a part of her now. A knock rattled the door, sharp, human. She froze, flashlight aimed, and cracked it open. The clerk stood there, patchy beard slick with sweat, eyes wide. "You gotta go," he said, voice tight. Folks next door heard singing, saw shadows, crops out back are blackening. "Whatever you brought, take it." He thrust a crumpled eviction note and retreated, footsteps fading fast. Maggie shut the door, heart pounding, and looked out. The field behind the motel was wilting, husks drooping, black ooze pooling at the roots. The lantern's light pulsed brighter, a beacon calling its curse. She packed her bag, camera, notebook, Daniel's photo, leaving the motel in the pickup's dust, the lantern heavy in her lap, hours blurred, towns passing in a haze. But the tapping followed, the whispers grew. Maggie, and the shadows trailed her, glimpsed in rearview mirrors, along roadside fields. She stopped at a diner, its neon sign buzzing, and sat in a corner booth, the lantern hidden in her bag. The waitress frowned, glancing at her stained sleeves, and neighbors whispered, crops failing nearby, kids missing. Maggie's hands shook as she sipped coffee, the sap dripping onto the table, unnoticed by others, but a stain she couldn't hide. Back in the truck, she drove until dawn, pulling into a rest stop. She drew the lantern out, its glow steady, and stared at it, Daniel's photo beside her. The scratches pulsed, sap trickling, and her shadow on the truck's wall stretched, tall, thin, skeletal, holding the lantern's shape, though her hands stayed still. She gasped, dropping it, but it landed upright, light flaring. The whispers swelled, Maggie, and the tapping circled. Tap, 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 a chorus of hunger she'd carried too far. The light wasn't hers to escape, it was hers to spread, and the world was bleeding with her. Chapter 12, The Final Debt. Maggie drove through the night, the bone lantern's glow a constant ember in her lap. Its bone tendrils fused to her hands, pulsing with a life she couldn't extinguish. Weeks on the road had worn her thin, her eyes sunken, her scratched arms a map of black scars, sap weeping from the cracks like tears. The tapping, tap, 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 followed her, a rhythm etched into her skull, mirrored by the lantern's light and the whispers, Maggie, that seeped from every shadow. The curse had spread, crops blackened in her wake, towns whispered of missing souls, and her shadow stretched skeletal and wrong, a keeper's silhouette she couldn't outrun. Daniel's photo sat beside her, his grin faded, a relic of a life she'd lost to this nightmare. She knew where it ended, Marrow Field. The highway looped back, inevitable as fate, and dawn broke as she rolled into the town's ruins. It was a ghost now. Buildings collapsed into splintered husks, streets choked with wilted corn, black ooze pooling in cracks. The air stank of rot, thick and choking, the fields a festering wound under a sky heavy with gray. The well waited at the heart, its stone rim crumbled, the ground around it split wide, bones gleaming faintly beneath. She parked the truck, legs trembling as she stepped out, the lantern heavy, its light flaring brighter with each step toward the abyss. The tapping surged, tap, 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 vibrating the earth, calling her. She clutched the lantern, its glow spilling over the well, illuminating the writhing mass below, hundreds of bones, tangled and alive, reaching up with skeletal hands that glowed like embers. The whispers roared, Maggie, a demand she couldn't ignore. She dropped her bag, Daniel's photo tumbling out, and saw his face, not grinning, but hollow, the dream version that had led her here. I'm sorry, she whispered, voice breaking, and pulled a gasoline can from the truck, the last of her plan. The ground shuddered as she approached the well, the lantern's light pulsing in her hands, sap dripping faster, staining her boots. She uncapped the can, splashing fuel over the lantern, the bones, the ooze, its fumes sharp in her lungs. The hunger stirred, a low growl rising from the depths, and the bones surged higher, clawing at the rim. She struck a match, hand steady despite the fear, and dropped it. Flame erupted, roaring up the well, the lantern catching fire, its bone cracking, sinew sizzling as the glow flared blinding white. The hunger screamed, a sound like shattering earth, and rose, its skeletal form bursting from the fissure, corn husks and bone weaving into a towering nightmare. Its maw gaped, teeth gnashing, black sap flooding the field as it lunged for her. Maggie stood her ground, the lantern burning in her grasp, its tendrils searing her flesh. Take me, she rasped, voice raw. end it. The flames climbed her arms, the scratches igniting, sap fueling the blaze. The hunger's claws raked her, pulling her toward its vortex, but she held fast, the lantern's light clashing with its darkness. A memory flashed, Daniel, alive, laughing in a field, and she clung to it, tears streaming as the fire consumed her. The hunger roared, its form buckling, bones snapping under the sheet. The townsfolk's lanterns, scattered in the ruins, flared once, then died, their light snuffed out. The ground heaved, the fissure collapsing, swallowing the hunger back into the earth, its scream fading to a hollow wail. Maggie fell, the lantern crumbling to ash in her hands, her body a torch against the black ooze. The flames spread, engulfing the cornfield, a cleansing blaze that roared through Marrowfield's decay. She sank into the ash, vision blurring, Daniel's hollow face fading from her mind. The tapping stopped, the whispers silenced, the lantern's glow gone. The fire burned out, leaving a smoldering wasteland, blackened husks, shattered bones, and a single bone fragment glowing faintly in the ashes, the last echo of the pact. Miles away, a farmer paused, his crops untouched, the rot stalled. A faint tapping, tap, tap, drifted on the wind, then stilled, a whisper lost to the plains. Maggie was gone, her debt paid, but the earth remembered, quiet for now, its hunger sated, until the next keeper